Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show where I talk about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about Season 1, Episode 3 of The Last of Us. Great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. So I thought it was so interesting, obviously, first and foremost, I love how they changed so much in this. Obviously, this is like a major departure from the game in obviously a lot of aspects. But I mean, obviously, we already knew we were dealing with something very different considering they were like Bill and Frank's. Once again, like Joe didn't know about Frank until after like he met up with Bill in the game. So making that already a pre-established dynamic between them and leaning into it even more is kind of interesting. And obviously, her continuous world building, but Joel making that little grave for Tess. I mean, and that's the even sadder thing about the Tess thing is he doesn't, well, for one, obviously in the game, she gets shot. So, obviously considering the circumstances, you can't go back and get her body regardless. So he was never able to bury her body. There's nothing to bury, at least in this series, it makes it even sadder. But, I mean, maybe, and it's, you know, I don't even know if I call it a silver lining. Maybe it's kind of a blessing because now you don't have to worry about her body being left there to rot. Like there's nothing, potentially nothing left. But him making those stones, like that's the closest, we never really got to see him mourn Tess in the game. And I mean, not that I'm aware of, once again, not unless there's some dialogue or something like that, but it's like, yeah, it's just like, let's not talk about it. And even Ellie's quiet about it, and then he's like eating a little something, and he just like tosses it to her, cause like, right, like I brought it up last episode, like after it was all said and done, Joel doesn't say a word to Ellie, turns around and walks away, and now she's like, hey, I want to, and he's like, if you're going to say, I don't want to hear you say sorry. She's like, I wasn't going to apologize. You and Tess, you're the ones who decided to take this job. No one told you to take it. So don't like take it out on me for something that's not my fault. And I think Ellie said that because I do believe that because it is her like lashing out, but also it is her getting a little offensive because I think on some level, regardless of it all, she did kind of feel a little at blame. It's like, yeah, it's my fault this happened, but it's also like, right, like, it's not, like, it's just, as Tess kind of put it, like, right, like, our luck was going to run out at some point in time, and one of us was going to get infected, and this has ended up happening. And, but to me, I thought that was so interesting, because obviously, to my recollection, that's not a line of dialogue from the game, so to have that be her, like, combative in that regard, like, don't put it on me that Tess died, you guys decided to take this job, it's like, I think it's a little easier on her to say that, because also, I brought it up last episode, too, because and even in retrospect in the game, like, Tess and Ellie had the most back and forth dialogue. Like, obviously, Joel was there as well, but, like, I feel like, in retrospect, it's still been a while for me, so I might not be remembering as clearly, but I feel like Ellie and Tess had a lot more, like, conversations in the game, but obviously they leaned into it even more. Like, Joel was super quiet in those interactions, and it was mainly, like, Tess and Ellie dialogue last episode. So obviously it hits Ellie. Like obviously she didn't know Tess the way Joel did, but she got to, you know, she really liked Tess. So I thought that was just, so obviously it does sting a little bit. So I think that's also why she kind of bit back at Joel, because it's like, right, I didn't want Tess to die. In fact, you know, it's effed up to say, but I do believe she obviously liked Tess more than she did Joel. But, obviously, they having little moments of dialogue here and there as they're, like, traveling along. And, they obviously, at one point in time, the conversation of, well, how did it all happen started? And it's like, for Joel, he basically broke it down. It's like, it literally happened over a single weekend. It's like, right, something got mixed into the cordyceps, they mutated, got into the food, and he started listening to stuff, and then he's paused, and then he says, pancake mix. I didn't catch that like other people did. Like, there's plenty of videos, I've watched enough people talk about it a little bit, about the whole aspect of, right, because they made a whole point of him not being able, like, Sarah not making pancakes. So I didn't even catch that other people did. So for that to be an aspect, and for him to get to that point and pause and then say, pancake mix, you know, it's just, if they had made, if pancakes had gotten made that morning instead, if Sarah had made those instead, like, they'd be having a completely different conversation, you know? It's like, the situation wouldn't have been what it was, though, but it's just, all it takes is one thing being different. But the point was, he was like, yeah, basically Monday came, because it was like a weekend. It was like Friday, and then like the weekend happened, and then, yeah, and then Monday, yeah, the world was gone, you know? There was even a little commentary of like, oh yeah, like, oh, didn't Fedra teach you? He's like, yeah, but she's like, yeah, a crappy government not being able to stop a pandemic. You're like, ooh, ha ha ha. Oh, that's an interesting, very, very interesting line. Obviously, you can read into that a lot more. Obviously, it's very, very pertinent for this show, but also it's like, yeah, hitting on the real life stuff as well. So I thought that was interesting. But they went to stop for supplies at a place. He's like, yeah, I dropped stuff here years ago. I just don't know where it is. And Ellie goes on her own and finds it infected, and she like cuts into it, and she's just staring at it, and then she kills it, which I think is so interesting that it is a moment that Ellie gets to have to herself that Joel will never know about. But I think it's also, that's why I'm also like, I think that's her kind of like, well, for one, it's like, right, this could be me if I wasn't infected, or because this person's infected, this is what would have happened to Tess if she was left alone. So it's that thing of like, right, someone that you like got infected, which we know there's a lot more to that story, and obviously with Ellie's circumstances, and I think maybe we haven't touched on that story a lot, you know, the Left Behind story. We'll kind of leave it at that, the DLC from the first game. Some of that stuff, without talking about it for anyone that doesn't know about it. Obviously, if you don't know anything about the story, do not look into that. It's spoilers. I mean, it's side story stuff, but it's still spoilers a little bit about Ellie's past. I know for sure they're covering it in the story because there's stuff. I never saw the trailer, the official trailer, but like, or at least I probably skimmed through it without really paying attention just to get like a thumbnail for something. But I've seen it. There's certain things related to be like, oh, yep, that's in the teaser. So I know that you're going to cover that storyline. But my point is that I don't know if that kind of, like, there's a culmination of many different things that could be in that moment. It's like, hey, I get to be immune. Other people aren't so lucky, like Tess or other people that might be important to me. And then on top of that, it just could be a thing of, oh, I need to kill you because I need something to hit. I need something. I need to, like, that's her way of dealing with things too. Like, she's cracking jokes because that's her way of, like, dealing with everything. But I think that also kind of gave her some, like, it just, like, right, it's almost like killing one for Tess to some extent. Like, I think there's so much that could be a multitude of things. I don't think it's just one thing. I think there's so many facets of everything going on in that moment of her killing that runner, that infected. But yeah, they end up leaving, and obviously obviously, like, she got like some tampons, and I'm like, oh man, or pads or whatever, and I'm like, huh. I was like, I was like trying to think, like, did those type of conversations ever come in the game? I was like, I don't think they did. I mean, obviously, it's like, it's a video game, so you're going to brush over that stuff, but it's just like, yeah. So along the way, obviously it's like, oh man, you got to fly in the sky. And it's like, yeah, we kind of took it for granted about like, yeah, you didn't think about it, you know, because obviously you had those first world issues. You're just like, oh yeah, having to pay for a middle seat and stuff like that. And Ellie's like, shut up, you got to go in the sky. And he's like, yeah, so did those people before that plane crash, which has also got to sting a little too, because we know that the plane crash is the reason why him and Tommy's vehicle crashed too, so. But they come across, like, some bodies that he didn't want her to see. And it's like, because she's like, oh, what is it? Like an axe murder or something? But it's like, no, it's a whole bunch of dead bodies that were there. Basically, when the government was coming to, like, clear out these houses, like the soldiers or whatever, they ended up killing a whole bunch of people. It's like, because it was like, oh, they're going to take you to the QZ if there was room. And ended up killing these people. It's like, they weren't even infected, were they? It's like, maybe, maybe not. It's like, but why kill them then? It's dead people don't get infected, and you're like, Jesus. And they did a heartbreaking thing of like zooming in on two particular bones, and then we flash back to 2003, and we see that was a mother and her child. I'm like, Jesus, because I was like, those look like those could be small, but oh, cool. It was a mom and her baby. But then we get Bill's side of things, and because obviously they lean into it, even obviously in the game, he was always the doomsday prepper-ish guy. He was always a little paranoid and weird. But the fact is that he stayed behind. He's like, oh, you're not going to get me. And lucky for him, he didn't go. Because if he did, he super would be dead. So because of that, he was prepped, he was ready, and by the time things, he made the town kind of his, set up defenses, set up all this stuff, and he was on his own for a while, eating food, like he was prepped. Like, this is, as he kind of puts it, like, not prepper, survivalist is kind of like he titles it. And then he ended up meeting Frank. It's like, hey, the man in the hole, which I thought was so interesting because I think, once again, it's in the teaser, and once again, I think they kind of hid this very well. I just assumed when I saw that scene, knowing Nick Offerman was playing Bill, I was like, oh, so instead of having the sequence from the video game where Joel falls into one of Bill's traps, being upside down, I was like, oh, he must fall into a hole or something. That's what they're changing it for. I think other people had that same assumption too. And it's like, no, that was not even related to Joel. It's Bill and Frank's story. And it's like, okay, gave him a hot shower, fixed him some food, gave him some wine. And we got to see a love story evolve. Like, you never thought in this storyline that, there are love stories in this series. Spoilers, but man, like part 2 is when you lean into more love story stuff or like relationships. That doesn't really, it's not really much of a thing at all in one. Like maybe one particular relationship. And one, spoilers, Tommy? Like, Tommy and his wife, that's the only, like, relationship-ish. Well, obviously, it's like, more like an intimate relationship like that, because I was like, well, there's the Joel and Ellie of it all. That relationship is the core foundation of this franchise, of the series, so... but it's like, yeah, like that, I guess because, and that in itself actually leans into something interesting that other people talk about too, is because it is a video game, you always stay with Joel and Ellie, so kind of never getting like too outside of their realm of their story, and we have, especially this episode where we cut away from Joel and Ellie for like 75% of the episode, it's about Bill and Frank. And their love story and just everything that they went through. And it's like, oh, like, that was Bill. Like, yeah, Bill's been with someone before, but it was a girl and, him and Frank ended up happening. It's like, right. It's like he was playing on a piano and it's like, oh, who's the girl? It's like, there's no girl. He's like, it's like, I know. So it's like, right. He's like, I'm not a whore. So, I'm not gonna, I'm gonna stick around for a couple days. A couple days turned in, which I immediately was like, well, since there's a Bill and Frank, I was like, those few days turned into a couple years, isn't it? And I do love that it isn't like because I would have thought maybe we would have gotten, once again, in my head, I thought like, okay, what we're going to get is we're building this up right here. And then like, we'll get kind of something similar to the game. Which also, once again, kind of makes me feel like, okay, because they aren't doing the spores thing, we're not getting bloat. Like, I brought that up last episode. This section of the game is where you got introduced to bloaters. This was where you've had the first bloater boss fight. And that sequence, none of that happened, obviously. But it's, like, so interesting to me. So I was like, okay, so they're not doing bloaters. Or like that, or they're going to come up in the story in a later, different fashion, maybe. I don't know. Like, obviously, it's an adaptation. That's why it's like, right, when it comes to the video game, you kind of, always go back because it is going to be a very different, it's going to be a similar yet different experience for the show for those who've only seen the show and who've never played the game or don't know the game. I don't know, it's just interesting. But, yeah, like, obviously Bill and Frank having their disagreements, which they had it too. And that's also something I talked about too, was like Bill and Frank, it's something that it was implied. It's heavily implied, but I don't think there was anything explicitly saying like Bill and Frank were a thing. Because Bill in the game always just like, yo, my partner, and they had their like disagreements. And so I think we got little elements of that early on, because like no relationship is going to be perfect. There's going to be ups and downs. It's like, all right, I want to paint stuff. I've been on the radio with someone. It's like, well, you been on the radio with who? With who, Frank? Like, and it's Joe and Tess, which I was like, wow, we're getting more Tess. Holy, wow. I was like, that took me by surprise when I saw Anna Torv. I was like, whoa, dude, I wasn't expecting us to get any more Tess. I would have thought last episode would have been, because I haven't looked into the IMDb of like how many episodes like certain people were going to be in. So I had I was like, oh, that's going to be your last episode. Did not even just on a small part like that was so interesting. Which also makes me wonder, like, could we still get more Tess in the future or not? Probably not, just to make it even stink even more this episode, making that kind of even more so like the last time you see her. I think we'll kind of play into that with just kind of the parallels that we'll get to that later, but the parallels with just everything Joel's feeling and like everything with Tess and just the Bill and Frank of it all. I think storytelling wise, I feel like it being potentially the last time you see her in this episode in that regard in a flashback kind of makes that parallel like even hit even harder to some extent. But like I said, we'll kind of go through it. But yeah, a friendship, because like Frank was like, we're gonna have friends. Bill's like, there's no one here. We're not friends. There's just kind of us. But like seeing Bill, who was, and that was also Bill's thing. That was the whole reason why Frank had such an issue with Bill. It's like, right, here you are, you're stuck in your ways, and you're gonna stay in this little town, stuck in your ways. Well, I'm gonna get out of here, and even if I die or whatever, oh well, it's better to be stuck with you. And it's like to see that. Think about that in the game versus what we got in the show. It's such a wild and stark difference. It's there, but it's like they had more time to grow. There was, I don't think, there's no explicit like time framing of like how long like Bill and Frank were like partners, as he wanted to put it in the game versus like the show. But I love that it's like, yeah, Tess and Frank are obviously hitting it off, and then you just have like the awkwardness of Bill sitting at the table with Joel. It's like, oh, so were you a prepper? It's like, no, survivalist. It's like, okay. But it's like, hey, that fencing got about a year. I can get you some like stuff that'll last you like in your entire life. And then says, well, lives. So it's like, right, I got your back. And it turns out Frank is the one who came up with the decade music system. It's like, right, that way we have so it's like, oh, that was his whole thing. And so they actually had, like, it seems like Joel and Tess were the only friends they had over the years. So I'm assuming, like, Joel and Tess would stop by from time to time and stuff, you know? And they would probably communicate here and there. But, I love the whole, like, oh, I traded, some Tess, like, a gun for some seeds. It's like, which gun? Don't worry, a small one. And they made started growing strawberries. It was actually really beautiful. And also for Bill, well, later on, because Joel was like, right, you need to be prepped for like raiders. That's what you need, because you're ready for the dead and stuff. No, oh God, what were those homemade bombs? You know, they're shrapnel bombs. That's where you learn about how to make them, because those were Bill's traps. It's interesting too. I guess they also did that because they didn't want to go too visceral in the show. Because people had talked, like, I want to say, what was it? Christian had talked about it on one of the episodes of The Big Thing. Christian Harloff had, about how obviously The Walking Dead is super brutal. That show never strayed away from like it would be like ripping people apart brutal. The Last of Us can be like that too, if like, you know, the particular bombs I talked about would lead to explosions. In this, they're just like, they're tied to guns that shoot. So because they're not trying to get this as visceral, that's kind of not what this show's going for. And so it's not nearly as visceral as the game is. So I think that's interesting, like change. I'm sure it's also obviously a little more practical. Probably like real world wise, whereas like video game wise, you can kind of go a little above and beyond like that. Basically making essentially, like, you know, like I said, homemade shrapnel bombs type of thing. I just thought that was kind of an interesting change. But the Raiders showed up. They're getting lit on fire and shot. And Bill gets shot. And you have Frank taking care of him. It's like, it's okay. He's like, all right, call Joel. He'll take care of you. I made copies of all the keys. I've got all this stuff. And it was like, because he thought he was going to die. And it's just like, I want to make sure that you're taken care of when I'm not here. And it's like, it's okay. And then we skip to 10 years later and kind of vice versa. It's like, right, that was the thing. They took care of each other. But I think it's more so a lot of the time Frank ended up taking care of Bill. And now as time passed, Frank sadly ended up getting sick. And Bill had to take care of him. And it was pretty rough, and I think Frank wanted to go out on his own terms, because it's like, right, Because you also have to think about it too. Once again, it's 2000. Everything in this world is stuck in 2003 because that's the day that the world fell apart. What I mean by that is, he's like, right, my situation, there was no like there was no cure for it, even when the world was still whole, but everything kind of fell apart, and so of course, saying, applying like, right, of course, there's still being no like, because any medical advancements that might have helped with his condition never happened in this universe. So he wanted to kind of go like in his own way. It's like, right, you're going to take these, what you're going to do is we're going to go down to that, the boutique. We're going to pick out suits that I choose for us. We're going to get married, and then we're going to, have dinner and some wine, and you're going to crush those pills up in my wine, and, I'm going to like, fall asleep in your arms and die in your arms, and that's what's going to happen. And you have to do this for me because you love me, right? And they do it, but when the time comes, well, even, it's like, right, circling back to their first, like, time meeting, like, the same meal, the same wine and everything, but then it's like, turns out Bill's killing himself as well. I was like, wait, whoa, that's what really shocked me, was like, there were already pills in a bottle, weren't there? It's like, yeah, enough to kill a horse. It's like, because for me, he's like, I'm already owed. I'm satisfied with the life I've lived because my purpose was kind of being with you, looking after you. Like, you were my purpose. So this is what I want. He's like, all right, I don't know how I feel about this. But he also says, like, in a very, like, when you look at it objectively, he's like, it is very romantic. So it's like, right, take me to bed. And they died together. I wasn't expecting it. I was like, wow. Which is also interesting, too, because it's like, right, in this universe, Ellie never got to know... I mean, yes, Bill was very begrudging and just like, obviously this world hardened him. But despite that, I think that is such a beautiful adaptation of making it so, like, right, I think it's actually sweeter to some extent because it's like, right, Bill was just, like, angry and just bitter, which Joel kind of is, but for him to find that humanity again, because like Bill even admit, like, he's like, I didn't like people, but it took one person coming into his life to kind of change everything for him, especially because he spent the first 4 years alone before he ended up meeting, wasn't it like 4 years before? I think it was like 2003 to 2007, or am I thinking about? I might be confusing the dates, but I mean, obviously he was with himself a long time. I mean, that was also the thing too. Him and Frank had like 15, 16 years together, dude. And that was beautiful. In the moment Joel rolls up, obviously once again you don't have the whole like getting around the town gameplay element, and they end up in Bill's place, and the door was locked to the room, and Ellie found the note. It's like, hey. He's like, even saying like, right, we weren't really friends, but you kind of were. You were the closest thing I had. He's like, I didn't really like people, but I found that. He's like, actually, I liked it when everyone else died, but then I found that one person. You kind of do whatever you got to do to protect that person, and then like in that moment, Ellie's like, so take all this stuff and make sure you keep. And then Joel had to read the rest of the letter. Keep Tess safe, which made that even harder. He's just like, all right, stay here. And he walks out, and it's just like, because small moments is all you really got in the game, and I love that they're keeping that even in the show too, where it's like, once again, making a grave for her, like the silent treatment he's given Ellie, and him just kind of like, and I think there's kind of a neat parallel too, because it's almost, well, it's essentially a suicide note, but it's like Frank had left one for Bill, and I think it's interesting too, because there's a game mechanic of like when Bill gets it, like when he like Bill, because you can get it, read it, and then bring it to Bill, and Bill will read over it. Okay, he'll crumble it up and throw it on the ground, and then you can go back over and pick it up, and the note's actually crumpled up when you pick it up again. That's a whole thing, right? So it's almost an interesting parallel in that regard, where Joe reads a note and he crumples it up, because it's just another reminder that Tess is going. And then we have some of the conversations that Ellie had earlier with Joel. Not in the show, but in the game, where she's like, about Tess, he's like, what we're going to do is, few ground rules. One, you don't ever bring up Tess, ever. Let's not talk about each other. Let's keep our past mystery. We don't get to know about each other. And then 3, you do what I say. And she's like, yeah. Because I like I said, I do believe there is guilt on, like, she doesn't need to feel guilty. It's just a shitty circumstance that led to it. But I do believe on some level Ellie does feel partially responsible for Tess. She shouldn't, but it's like, you can't tell someone, you know, that guilt is there, whether, you know, you can't really, like, kind of push that away from somebody. And no matter what you say, they're going to feel that, like, if that's how they feel. So I think Ellie was kind of feeling guilty about it. It was weighing on her the entire time, and just having that, you know, and it's sad too, just because of the parallel between Bill and Frank, because Bill and Frank probably were like the closest thing Joel had to a friendship. And it's also a reminder of, like, especially because Bill and Frank were so open about what they had, whereas Joel and Tess, once again, that line of, you never felt the same way about me. And Joel probably did, but it was hard for him to ever express that. And it's like, all this time we spent together, and so much I never got to say, so much we never got to do. And it's like, I think it's an interesting juxtaposition where Joel and Tess had their relationship and it was very different, like, so much left unsaid. Bill and Frank got to have an all cards on the table type of situation. Because even Frank said that line of, I'm not going to sit here and say something cheesy quote like, oh, these are the best days of my life or something like that. Because he's like, I had some bad days. I even had some bad days with you. But the good days I had with you are like the best days I've ever had with anybody, you know? So I think that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. Obviously, they went through, like, Bill's armament and stuff like that. And now we also know what the 80s music was about. Because it's like, okay, from the end of the first episode, it's like, Bill had it set so that every few weeks he has to reset the countdown, but he didn't because he was dead, because it was like August 29th, I think they said, so they'd been dead a few weeks, you know, by the time, like, him and Tess were on the way. Obviously it's like, you know, that, you know, so it's actually really, really sad on just so many levels. And that's why I'm saying, like, it adds even more to, like, maybe making, like, this the final episode you even see Tess in, even if it's in a flashback, and also having her, like, it's just, it makes that parallel sting, because the only thing we got, because Bill never knew about Tess, because Joel never talked about it, because he's like, oh, Tess, and then, like, Joel, like, it's like, oh, like, well, how you let Tess drag you into it, and Joel was like, don't bring Tess into this, and that was about it. And then around that time is when they found Frank's body in the game, after he hung himself. So once again, it's just an interesting parallel. So, and Ellie ended up grabbing a gun secretly without telling Joel, and put it in her bag, and they ultimately end up bouncing, both taking showers, both freshened up. He shaved a little. She's like, oh, look at you. He's like, shut up, come on, let's go. Once again, don't have to do, well, ended up having to kind of make a battery and charge it for the vehicle. For Ellie, it's like, right, it's the first time she's in a vehicle. Joel had to be like, yeah, put on your seatbelt. She's almost like, what? And he puts it on, and she's like, oh, this is so cool. Once again, just a very different circumstance. And the song, what was it, Linda something, or like, it's not someone I'm familiar with at all. It seems like it's very, probably, like, very old school. I'm not well versed in old school, which I'm like, yeah, I'm 30, so, like, my old school versus someone who's younger, old school is going to be very different, you know. It's not songs that I'm familiar with that much, so when it's all said and done, oh man, we don't even get the magazine scene from the game. She's like, oh, why are these pages we don't even get that. But nevertheless, once again, because of how vastly different this was, it now begs the question with certain characters that there's two characters in particular. I'm like, so would their story play out exactly the same, or are they going to change it? I'm curious to see how that plays out, because this played out way differently. So that's definitely going to be interesting. I'm also curious, like, the next gameplay section after this, like, where Joel and Ellie end up. I'm like, are we going to see that sequence at all in this, or like, how is that going? Because that's what I'm curious, because that's a pretty big, like, I don't even know if I'd say set piece situation, but kind of, sort of, like, I'm curious to see if that ends up being something that happens or not, or is that something that's going to be completely skipped over? Like, what's going to be there in its place? Are they going to do like a smaller like, I'm so curious to see what happens next. Obviously, I'm avoiding previews to the next episodes because I'm saying that rhetorically. I want to know, but rhetorically speaking, but I don't actually want to know because I want to like go into these episodes as knowing as little as possible. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see where all this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I wanted to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and goodbye.